This happened in the small town of Insuline, Michigan, with a population of just about 2,500 residents. In one of the houses located on a quiet street on the outskirts of town, a horrific crime took place. The police struggled for a long time to piece together the numerous clues and leads they found at the scene. But unexpectedly, a witness appeared whose testimony helped shed light on this complex case. He clearly remembered the last words of the victim before death. This story is about how the persistence and professionalism of the police helped solve a brutal murder and achieve justice, despite what seemed to be a dead end in the investigation. Martin Durham, born in 1969, grew up in the town of Grand Rapids, Michigan, in a family with several children. His parents owned a house in the countryside, so Martin's childhood was spent in the picturesque surroundings of nature. Like many boys his age, he enjoyed fishing, hiking, and was fond of photography, trying to capture bright moments of life. Often together with his older cousin, they would take a tent, backpacks, and go on multi-day hikes, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of the surrounding landscapes. Over the years, a strong friendship developed between them that lasted a lifetime. Martin met his first love at the age of 17. Her name was Glennon Johnson. She was a year older than him. The young people lived next door to each other and went to the same school. But their whirlwind romance did not last long, and soon they broke up. However, something elusive continued to draw them to each other, perhaps the memories of the brightness of first feelings. They got back together, but then broke up again, and this happened several times. Martin and Glennon had a lot in common, so despite the breakups, they constantly gravitated towards each other. Perhaps the reason was the similarity of interests and hobbies that made them kindred spirits. But at some point, they still decided to finally part ways and go their separate ways. A long time passed before the former lovers saw each other and talked again. During this time, another girl appeared in Martin's life, to whom he immediately felt a liking. It was Christine Keller. A spark very quickly ignited between them, and soon they began living together. After just a few months, Martin realized that Christine was the one with whom he wanted to link his life. In 1989, the couple got married. The parents gave the newlyweds a separate house in a residential area of the city where they moved. Over the next few years, they had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Christine devoted herself to housekeeping and raising the kids, while Martin took on the responsibility of providing for the family. He not only worked as an auto mechanic, but also for many years moonlighted at a local restaurant. The income was quite decent, and the family had enough to live on. However, the first years of family life turned out to be difficult, especially considering that all 3 children were born one after the other. The shoulders of the young parents were burdened with a lot of worries and cares associated with caring for the babies. Constant lack of sleep and fatigue made themselves felt, because of which the couple began to quarrel more and more often. But they did not give up and were full of determination to cope with all the difficulties. Martin proved to be a caring and loving father who tried with all his might to provide a decent life for his family. To many, he seemed like an exemplary family man. But unfortunately, even Martin's attitude towards his family did not protect him from the tragic events that happened in 1995. One day, a truck whose driver ignored a red traffic light crashed into Martin's car at full speed. The damaged car dragged the passenger car along with the driver for several dozen meters, after which it finally stopped. As a result of this terrible accident, Martin received serious injuries, multiple fractures, including ribs, jaw and legs, as well as a severe traumatic brain injury. A significant area of the brain was damaged. The best doctors fought for Martin's life, but despite all their efforts, he fell into a coma in which he remained for several months. During this time, he had to undergo several complex surgeries. Surviving was a miracle, and ahead of him was a long and difficult recovery period. Even such seemingly elementary things as the ability to sit or hold his head, Martin had to relearn from scratch. He actually had to learn to control his body anew. In addition, his face was disfigured, and some brain functions were irretrievably lost. But despite all this, Martin did not give up. He continued to fight to return to normal life and be with his family again. At first, the man could not do without a wheelchair at all. Then for a long time he moved on crutches. Gradually, his health improved, but only physically. Psychologically, Martin was broken. He realized that he would no longer be able to work as a mechanic and support his family as before, and now his capabilities were severely limited due to the injuries he sustained. All this turned his former life upside down. The most painful thing for Martin was the realization that he would no longer be able to lead the active lifestyle he was used to. Previously, he loved spending time in nature, going hiking, fishing, and now he was forced to stay at home around the clock, and sometimes even be bedridden. Every movement was given with incredible difficulty and was accompanied by severe pain, which could only be dulled by the most powerful painkillers. And judging by the doctor's predictions, Martin would have to put up with these consequences of the accident for the rest of his days. But it was not only the victim himself who suffered from this situation, but also his loved ones. It was especially difficult for his wife Christine, who had previously been engaged only in household chores and raising children, and now she was forced to urgently look for a job and arrange for the kids to go to kindergarten in order to somehow make ends meet and provide for the family. She also had to take care of her disabled husband. It's good that relatives came to the rescue, thanks to whose support Christine was able to cope with the trials that fell on her. But as it turned out, financial difficulties were not the only problem. According to Christine, Martin became irritable, often snapped at her, showing incomprehensible aggression and hostility. In addition, due to a brain injury, he began to have memory problems. The man forgot not only some long-standing events, but also what had been happening to him and his family in recent years. It happened that he could not remember the names of his children, and many friends with whom Martin had been close for decades, he now perceived as completely unfamiliar people. All this led to the fact that Martin began to withdraw into himself more and more and move away from others. He simply could not maintain normal communication due to constant confusion in his head, memory problems, and lack of concentration. The man became alienated and indifferent to everything. He spent most of his time alone with his thoughts, which he did not share with anyone. At the same time, Martin continued the course of treatment and rehabilitation. He regularly attended physiotherapy procedures. From time to time, he was admitted to the hospital for another examination. During this period, he had to change several doctors, and finally, the first positive results began to appear. Martin's physical condition improved significantly, although the psychological consequences of what he had experienced still made themselves felt. Christine recalled this difficult period of their life with sadness and pain. She understood how hard it must be for her husband. After all, he had always been so punctual and pedantic before, especially when it came to finances, and now he could not even count his own money. At the same time, Martin constantly controlled and criticized his wife's expenses, which only increased the tension in their relationship. The young family was going through really hard times. Its head had to fight every day not only with physical pain and the consequences of injuries, but also with psychological problems. The inability to cope with some of them made Martin irritable and angry. He snapped at Christine for any reason, although she did not deserve it at all. For some time, Christine tried to treat this with understanding. She realized that it was very difficult for Martin now, and tried to accept all these changes in his character. But nothing lasts forever, and one day her patience ran out. 2 years after the ill-fated accident, she filed for divorce. Later, the woman admitted that she took this step not out of good life, but simply because Martin had become completely unbearable. For the man, this was another blow. For a long time, he felt resentment and bitterness over Christine's decision to leave him. The ex-wife took the children and moved out of their shared home, while Martin remained under the supervision of his parents, who visited him regularly. But life did not end there. It was necessary to move on, and Martin did not even think to stop and give up. The man received a decent insurance payout, which he decided to invest in real estate. He bought a new house in another area. In addition, throughout the recovery period, Martin received a monthly monetary compensation for the accident. This allowed him to stay afloat and provide for his existence. Martin moved into his new home not alone, but with a parrot that remained from his former family life. Christine loved this bird very much, but decided to leave it to her ex-husband so that he would not be so lonely. The parrot was already quite old, but became a real joy and moral support for Martin in his new place. The only consolation for Martin in his new life was his faithful feathered friend, a 15-year-old African grey parrot named Bud. It was in this unusual company that the man settled in a house located in the Sand Lake area, about 36 kilometers from his former home. Martin was determined to regain his strength as soon as possible, get back on his feet and start living a full life, primarily for the sake of his children. He settled in and adapted quite quickly in his new place. Despite the divorce, the man continued to maintain close ties with his sons and daughter, communicating with them regularly. Moreover, he even managed to establish quite friendly relations with his ex-wife. She noted that Martin had some inner core and a clear goal to get back on his feet as soon as possible and return to normal life. Behind the house, Martin laid out a small garden and enjoyed arranging it. It turned out that the man had a real talent for landscape design and gardening. The neighbors quickly appreciated his abilities in this area and began to turn to him more and more often with a request to help them arrange their plots and take care of the lawn. In fact, this became an additional source of income for Martin, and most importantly, it restored his sense of self-worth and faith that he was able to overcome any difficulties. All this had a beneficial effect on Martin's condition. During this period, doctors recorded a stable, positive trend in him. Of course, the recovery was not as fast as we would like, but progress was obvious. However, despite the clear improvements in Martin's well-being and morale, his ex-wife was in no hurry to return to him. Christine was afraid that after calming down and believing in the irreversibility of the changes, Martin would again begin to demonstrate the negative sides of his personality, as it happened more than once before. Therefore, she decided to limit herself to only moral support for now. She met with her ex-husband, brought the children to visit him, but no more than that. But in 1997, Glenna Johnson, Martin's first love, suddenly reappeared on his horizon. By a twist of fate, she had also recently divorced her husband. The old acquaintances renewed their communication, which very quickly grew into something more. Old feelings flared up with renewed vigor. Glenna visited Martin more and more often, and soon moved in with him altogether. Her children from her first marriage stayed with their father, but the woman regularly took them to her place. Sometimes Martin's children also visited them. At moments when this large and noisy company gathered together, life in the house was full of dynamics. But for the most part, Martin and Glenna spent time alone. On quiet and peaceful days, the couple enjoyed their usual activities. They went fishing, hunting, and took walks together. As much as possible, Glenna tried to adapt to Martin's physical capabilities so that he could participate in all these activities. But of course, this was very difficult for him, so for the most part, they limited themselves to unhurried walks around the neighborhood or trips to the local casino. They were drawn there in memory of their cheerful and carefree youth. Over time, visits to this establishment became something like a traditional ritual for the couple. Every month they came here to try their luck and have fun. Glenna and Martin quickly became familiar faces in the local community. They often gathered numerous friends and acquaintances at their home, played poker with them, and cooked barbecue in the backyard. From the outside, they looked like a surprisingly harmonious and happy couple. Friends and acquaintances were convinced that Martin and Glenna had finally found each other after many years of wandering and were now enjoying their well-deserved happiness. So much so that they were not even too surprised when in the summer of 2005 the couple decided to officially formalize their relationship. However, some particularly close friends knew that behind the illusory facade of well-being hid a completely different reality. As you know, after the accident he survived, Martin changed a lot, and not for the better. He became harsh, demanding, and too controlling. Because of this, the couple often had conflicts. Martin tried in every possible way to limit Glenna's freedom. He did not like it when she spent time without him or did some things on her own. Among other things, he sought to completely control the finances and the distribution of money in the family, which also did not add harmony to their relationship. Glenna tried to maintain independence, at least in running the household, but even here there were no complaints from her husband. He constantly suspected her of hiding some expenses from him or spending too much money on unnecessary things. At that time, Martin continued to live on disability benefits, and his wife received payments as his guardian. But she had one ruinous hobby. She loved gambling and could lose a lot of money at the casino. In addition, the woman often visited there without her husband's knowledge, although she was a regular at this establishment. As a result, debts that only grew. Another area of constant tension in Martin and Glenna's relationship was his communication with his ex-wife, Christine. Obviously, he did not tire of complaining to his new chosen one about how the former abandoned him at the mercy of fate in the difficult period immediately after the accident, while not taking into account that he himself made Christine's life truly unbearable. Martin's ex-wife endured his antics for 2 whole years, but at some point she could not stand it and left him. However, she did not completely turn away from her husband, but tried to support him as best she could. She continued to communicate with him, brought the children to visit. Interestingly, at the same time, Martin apparently considered it possible to complain to Christine about his new wife, and not in the best terms, and his discontent gradually passed on to Glenna herself. There is information that she also did not hesitate in expressions when talking about the children of her husband from his first marriage. Of course, they told their mother everything, and in the end they refused to go to their father if his new chosen one was present there. They did not want to listen to unpleasant things about their own mother again and again. It is clear that Christine supported the children in this and stopped visits to her ex-husband. This situation could not but irritate Martin, so he snapped at Christine and constantly conflicted with her. All this affected his relationship with Glenna, which also became more and more tense. That is, family relationships at this stage were specifically upset, and by their behavior, all participants in this love triangle only aggravated the situation. By the way, there is one interesting detail that very eloquently testifies to the sincerity of Glenna's feelings for Martin, at least in the past. It turns out that on the back of her palm she had his name tattooed, which she made 18 years ago, during their first romance. And during all this time, she never removed the tattoo, apparently hoping to someday resume the relationship. It turns out that for all 15 years while Martin was married to another, Glenna continued to love him and wait. But despite such dedication from Glenna, little in the couple's current relationship resembled romance. Particularly often, conflicts arose between them over money, all because of Martin's suspicions that his wife was spending much more than she earned, because of which he constantly accumulated debts. To somehow plug holes in the budget, she periodically borrowed money from her husband, naturally, without his knowledge. Gradually, Glenna took complete control of the family finances, which only worsened the situation. The woman even began to appropriate checks from the insurance company that came in Martin's name every month. And also, according to available information, she secretly sold the painkillers that he took on doctor's orders. We are talking about potent drugs, the release of which is strictly regulated. It seems that Martin himself did not use them regularly, so considerable stocks accumulated in the house. Glenna took advantage of this by selling the drugs on the side. However, it is still not clear to what extent Martin was aware of this and whether he approved of such activities. There are different points of view on this matter. Some argue that the man himself was engaged in this dubious business since he began to recover from the accident, supposedly in order to compensate for the lack of income due to the absence of a permanent job. Others tend to believe that it was Glenna who, without her husband's knowledge, appropriated the remnants of the drugs and sold them, taking advantage of his forgetfulness due to injury. Be that as it may, but despite all these undercurrents, the unhealthy relationship in the couple lasted for over 11 years. By 2015, Martin and Glenna were still pretending to be a friendly couple, although they especially did not hide that the marriage was cracking at the seams. Quarrels broke out more and more often, and sometimes they were really serious. One of the couple's friends said that he even once witnessed an altercation during which Glenna threatened Martin with murder. Although it must be admitted that still most of the time they diligently played the roles of happy newlyweds, walking hand in hand, as at the very beginning of the relationship many years ago. However, in May 2015, the issue of divorce seems to have come to a head. One day at the beginning of the month, Christine suddenly learned that Martin was selling the house. She accidentally came across a corresponding announcement on an auction site and was terribly surprised by this. She immediately called her ex-husband to find out what was happening. In the conversation, she wondered why on earth he had decided to get rid of his beloved home, in the arrangement of which he had invested so much effort and soul. Martin was stunned by this news because he was not planning anything of the sort. He asked Glenna and heard that, most likely, some mistake had occurred and that she would certainly figure it out. But as far as we know, the wife never returned to this topic again, and the announcement meanwhile did not disappear. By the way, shortly before this, the couple had already had their car confiscated due to overdue loan payments. Then Glenna also convinced her husband that it was a misunderstanding and that she would quickly resolve the problem. But as we see, nothing changed as a result. The auction for the sale of the house was to take place literally in 3 weeks. Most likely, the reason for such an unexpected decision was Glenna's numerous debts, which she managed to accumulate over the years of marriage with Martin. Money was urgently needed, so the woman obviously planned to gain it from the sale of the house and thereby pay off the creditors. But she preferred not to tell her husband about it. She probably understood that he was unlikely to approve of such an initiative. Therefore, she acted secretly. And so on the morning of May 13, 2015, an incident occurred that later turned out to be fatal. One of Martin's neighbors came to his house around 8 a.m., intending to discuss some household issues. To the man's surprise, no one opened the door for him, although usually at this time the owner was already awake and going about his business pottering in the garage or in the garden. Moreover, Martin's car was parked near the house, so he clearly hadn't gone anywhere. It was also strange that Glenna, who also usually woke up early and was busy with household chores, did not respond. The neighbor nervously walked around the house, but in vain. Everywhere was quiet, and the garage was generally locked from the inside. However, the front door was open. The man entered the house, called out to the owners, but again silence in response. A little confused, he went to the couple's bedroom and froze on the threshold, struck by a terrible sight. Right in the middle of the room, Martin lay in a pool of blood, and next to him was his wife Glenna with a gunshot wound to the head. Frightened to death, the neighbor immediately ran out, assuming that an armed criminal might be hiding somewhere in the house. With trembling hands, he dialed 911 and called the police. When the ambulance staff arrived at the scene, they only threw up their hands. It was already impossible to help 46-year-old Martin. He was lying in bed in his underwear and, judging by the temperature of the body, had been dead for several hours. But his 47-year-old wife, although unconscious from blood loss, was still breathing. The woman was mumbling something incoherently, but the paramedics could not make out what exactly. Unlike Martin, she was fully clothed. Glenna was urgently taken to the hospital, where she was provided with the necessary medical assistance. In parallel, detectives arrived at the scene and began their investigation. As it turned out during the examination, both victims received numerous gunshot wounds. A total of 6 shots were fired, of which 5 were fatal for Martin, who died instantly. But his wife, one might say, was lucky she got off with only 1 shot through the skull, although the trajectory of the bullet's flight touched the brain, but not critically. Therefore, after the operation, the woman quite quickly began to recover, and after a few days she was ready to give testimony to the police, who were just eager to start interrogating her. In the meantime, the detectives limited themselves to a thorough examination of the crime scene, and a lot of what they saw frankly surprised and even alarmed them. In particular, they noticed that the picture clearly did not resemble the consequences of an ordinary robbery. After all, absolutely nothing of value disappeared from the house, including the couple's wallets and other personal belongings. Even the money lying in plain sight was for some reason not touched by the criminal. Even more alertness was caused by the fact that the attacker got into the house without any signs of breaking in. The front door was open, and the bars on the windows were intact. So, did Martin or his wife let the killer in themselves? If so, did they know him? Very strange. However, soon the investigators had another version. The reason for the attack could well have been a conflict over the Durham's dealings with the sale of prescription drugs. The police found out almost immediately that Martin and Glenna were doing something like this. It only remained to find out all the details of this scheme, who, to whom, what and in what volumes was selling. The detectives suggested that during one of these operations something went wrong, and a fight broke out between the couple and their clients, which ended in a shootout. To confirm or refute this hypothesis, criminologists sent all the material evidence found at the scene for examination, including weapons and cartridge cases, and the results were stunning. Firstly, the pistol from which both victims were shot belonged to Martin himself. He had kept it for many years, which completely ruled out the version with an outside attacker. Secondly, the location of blood traces and other biological fluids indicated that the main events unfolded not at all in the bedroom, where the bodies were found, but in the living room. There were a lot of splashes and streaks on the floor. In addition, judging by the shell casing found, at least 1 shot was fired in this very room. It turned out that first the shooting took place in the living room, but for some reason then it was decided to continue it in the bedroom, after moving one or both victims there. Why was it necessary to do this? The investigators had a growing feeling that someone had tried very hard to stage the crime scene, and deliberately clumsily, as if trying to confuse the traces, but doing it ineptly. Based on the results of examinations and additional examinations of the house, law enforcement officers came to an unexpected conclusion altogether. Namely, all the shots at Martin were fired exclusively in the bedroom, and his blood in the living room is for some reason absent, as there are no traces of dragging the body. Instead, there was a lot of blood that belonged to Glenna. It was she who was hit by the bullet, the shell of which was found in the same room. Strange, isn't it? The woman was shot in one room and found in a completely different one. How is this possible? Is it really possible that after being wounded in the head, she had the strength to independently climb to the 2nd floor and get to the bedroom? Forensic experts believe that this is so because the woman's injury turned out to be not as serious as it seemed at first glance, especially since Glenna, when she was found, was conscious. And yet this discrepancy made the detectives wonder, could Martin's wife herself actually be involved in his death? Perhaps she first shot her husband and then tried to settle scores with life, staging everything as if a robber had attacked the couple. The alleged suicide attempt in this case was only a disguise. Of course, such bold assumptions required weighty evidence. It was not yet possible to interrogate Glenna. The woman was still in the hospital. But it was possible, for example, to study her phone. This is what they did, and the results exceeded all expectations. It turned out that shortly before the tragedy, Glenna was actively searching the internet for information about the Ruger pistol, from which her husband was shot and she herself was wounded. She seemed to be interested in how to use it. Another important detail is that the woman Googled ways to identify counterfeit banknotes, and just a few hours before shots rang out in the house, she called her bank several times and was interested in the state of the account. Such actions may indicate some serious financial problems that pushed Glenna to extremes. This guess was brilliantly confirmed when 2 suicide notes written by Glenna were found at the crime scene. In one note, she apologized to her children, and in the other, she said goodbye to all her relatives and friends. It followed from these lines that the woman really intended to end her life. Unfortunately, one important piece of evidence that could link Glenna to Martin's death was missing. Experts did not find her fingerprints on the murder weapon. However, there were none at all. The gun was carefully wiped by someone. Perhaps Glenna herself after the shot? Strange, but not excluded. Having compared all the available evidence and facts, the detectives restored the probable course of events that morning. In their opinion, Glenna, driven into a corner by debts and financial problems, decided to settle scores with life. But before that, for some reason, she shot Martin probably in the bedroom, after which she went down to the living room and shot herself in the head there. However, she did not manage to die immediately, like her husband, so she reached their shared bed, where she was later found. Of course, the police were eager to talk to Glenna and ask her all these uncomfortable questions. Therefore, they were just waiting for the moment when the doctors would allow it. In the meantime, the investigators continued to collect evidence and strengthen the evidence base against the likely suspect. But the victim's relatives almost had no doubt that Martin was killed by his own wife. Martin's ex-wife, Christine Keller, was especially convinced of this. As they say, a woman sees right through a woman. Although this news came as a shock to her, she could not even imagine that Glenna was capable of such a terrible deed. However, she never liked Christine because of her extremely difficult and conflicted nature. The only thing that worried the widow now, apart from the death of her ex-husband, was the fate of their shared parrot. After everything that happened, the woman took the bird to her home, where he would now live with her children. And about a week later, detectives finally visited Glenna in the ward. The doctors gave the go-ahead for interrogation. By that time, she was already feeling well, had undergone all the necessary operations and was conscious. According to the doctors, she was quite capable of giving adequate testimony. It remained only to listen to what she would tell. However, despite the optimistic assessment of the doctors regarding Glenna's condition, during the interrogation she suddenly stated that she did not remember anything at all about the events of that morning. According to the woman, she never wrote any suicide notes and certainly did not plan to either kill Martin or lay hands on herself. Such total oblivion alarmed the police well. A person cannot remember absolutely nothing about such a horrible and traumatic incident, the center of which was herself. Moreover, Glenna time and again denied the very possibility of attacking her husband, but at the same time, as if deliberately emphasizing that she had no idea what had happened in their house a few days ago. You must admit, this is very strange and suspicious, and rather resembles a clumsy attempt to cover up traces and avoid responsibility. But well, the hands of the police were tied, because for an official accusation they did not yet have enough evidence. The investigation had to take a break, and only a few months later, when Glenna finally fully recovered and was discharged from the hospital, the department was able to resume this case. However, even in view of the new circumstances, the detectives understood that the evidence gathered was not enough. They were too indirect and ambiguous. This meant that there was a risk that the jury would not be convinced after all. Glenna could play on pity, pointing to her injury and complete memory loss. But it was at this moment that the unexpected happened. Assistance to the investigation was provided by the one from whom no one expected it at all. One night, Christine woke up from a strange noise on the first floor of the house. Suddenly, the parrot that had moved to her after the death of the owner started talking. The woman went downstairs and almost fainted from what she heard. The bird kept repeating the eerie phrase, "Please, Glenna, don't shoot." Moreover, he added these words exactly in the voice of Martin. Christine's hair literally stood on him from the realization of what she had just witnessed. Fortunately, she did not lose her head and was able to record this creepy monologue on the camera of her mobile phone.
Get your ass moving now! No!
And as soon as the video was ready, the woman, without wasting a minute, called the police and told about the incident. A few hours later, the detectives were already viewing the unique evidence. Of course, the parrot could not testify in court, and the police understood that the jury might consider such a detail too strange or even comical. But personally, they had no more doubts left. Glenna shot Martin and tried to hide it. New details of this high-profile case instantly leaked to the press and caused a huge stir among journalists and the public. Meanwhile, the investigation was going its own way, and finally, in June 2016, the long-awaited breakthrough occurred on the basis of the collected evidence base. Glenna was officially charged with first-degree murder, after which the woman was arrested and placed in custody. According to the data obtained during numerous forensic and ballistic examinations, the police bit by bit restored the picture of what actually happened in the Durham house that fateful morning. Investigators were convinced that, provided they were presented competently in court, this information would not leave the jury any chance to acquit the defendant. The detectives finally had the opportunity to help the unfortunate Martin find justice even after death. The prosecutor argued that Glenna's act was the result of a deep financial crisis in which she found herself due to her passion for gambling. Debts grew like a snowball, and the woman hid it from her husband, paying for everything with new loans and forging documents. When the scheme began to burst at the seams, Glenna decided to end her life. As proof of this intention, 2 suicide notes were provided, one addressed to Martin, the other to the children. By the way, it is in them that the key lies to understanding why it was the criminal's husband who became her first and only victim. Obviously, something went wrong and Glenna's plans were prevented from being realized. According to the version of the investigation, the decisive role here was played by the plans for the sale of the house, which Martin learned about literally on the eve of the tragedy. Presumably, the quarrel broke out between the spouses, and in order to get rid of the main source of stress, Glenna shot her husband in a fit of rage, and only then she tried to end her life. The prosecutor insisted that there could be no other explanation, but the defense, of course, denied everything. Both Glenna herself and her lawyer unanimously claimed that the woman, due to a head injury, does not remember the events of that morning at all. They also talked about how much the defendant loved Martin, which means she was simply unable to harm him. To explain Glenna's strange behavior during previous interrogations, complete refusal to cooperate with the investigation and memory lapses, the lawyers provided a list of potent drugs that the woman was taking to restore cognitive functions. The defenders did not forget to mention the strange coincidence with the search queries about weapons in the defendant's phone on the eve of the tragedy, they say. Glenna used the same device exclusively for online games. The trial lasted 10 days. The prosecution was confident in its evidence base, but at some point it became obvious that the jurors were hesitating because the lion's share of the facts provided by the investigation was indirect in nature. That's when the prosecution decided on an unprecedented step to show the video with Martin's parrot. A loud sigh swept through the courtroom when a bird appeared on the big screen, repeating over and over in the voice of the deceased, "Please, Glenna, don't shoot." The impression was reinforced by the speeches of ornithologists and animal psychologists, who unanimously confirmed, yes, parrots are capable of accurate imitation, especially if they are strongly attached to the owner and spend a lot of time with him. And these birds are usually very sensitive to stress and are able to remember for many years something that made a great emotional impression on them. This unexpected demonstration seems to have played a key role in the fate of the defendant. Already after 8 hours of discussion, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. Glenna Durham was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. The 49-year-old woman was shocked by such a severe punishment and continued to deny her guilt. Until the end, she could not believe that the jury had bought into what she called the nonsense of some parrot. Even after being behind bars, Glenna never admitted her guilt. She is still there today. But the exposing bird, after the end of the process, lived for a long time in the house of Christine, the ex-wife of the murdered man, and her children. It is believed that it was the involuntary testimony of the parrot that helped preserve the memory of Martin and ultimately restore justice. And although this bird, of course, did not reveal any new details of the crime, His words became a strong emotional argument that made everyone look at this case from a different angle. Her life became a vivid example of how fragile human existence is and how quickly everything can fall apart. Lauren was a beautiful soul with expressive green eyes. She had an unwavering belief in the goodness and sincerity of people. However, it was her very trusting nature and openness that led to the young woman's untimely demise. Lauren Hake was born in November 1993 in Seattle, Washington. She grew up in a well-off family. Her father, Jeff, owned a plumbing business, while her mother, Lonna, worked in real estate. Lauren had a very warm relationship with her older brother, Ryan. Lauren moved to Phoenix and enrolled in the Gary Manuel Aveda Institute, where she studied to become a cosmetologist and skincare specialist. The young woman always took meticulous care of her appearance and had an excellent understanding of cosmetics, so her education helped her develop her natural talents. Lauren began her career at the age of 18 and quickly achieved success. At first, she worked as a customer support representative. From 2015 to 2020, she held the position of a leading manager at the well-known cosmetics company Benefit. Then, for 9 months, she worked as a cosmetologist in a beauty salon. In October 2020, she took a job as a manager at the Center for Aesthetic Medicine. In addition, Lauren planned to follow in her mother's footsteps and try her hand at real estate. At the time of the tragedy, she was working full-time as an instructor at a golf club. Lauren was never afraid of challenges, was remarkably responsible, and easily found common ground with people. She actively developed her skills in the beauty industry, sports, and real estate. The young woman diligently watched her physical fitness, regularly visiting the gym and generally leading a healthy lifestyle. Lauren had a wide circle of friends and a loving family that always supported her. In her free time, the young woman engaged in beneficial activities. In addition to work, sports, and meeting up with friends, she loved traveling and hiking. It was her love for scenic trails that made Lauren fall in love with Phoenix. The young woman often took solitary walks, listening to music on her headphones and enjoying nature, fresh air, tranquility, and peace. Her favorite route was a trail in the northern part of the city, not far from her own apartment. There was hardly ever anyone there. Naturally, Lauren's parents were very concerned about her solitary wanderings through deserted places, but Lauren herself was convinced of her safety. Every morning, she thanked fate for another day lived and boldly set out on a walk. As her loved ones recounted, Lauren had a distinctive morning ritual. Upon waking up, she would drink coffee, chat with family and friends, and then go for a walk. The young woman did this every day, believing that such a start guaranteed a positive mood for the whole day. Unfortunately, she had no idea that her trusting nature and carelessness could play a fatal role. On April 28, 2023, everything began as usual. Lauren drank her coffee, talked on the phone with her loved ones, and then went for her usual walk in the northern district of Phoenix, not far from her home. Her route passed through a picturesque trail in a quiet, sparsely populated area. The one-way journey took 15-30 minutes. The young woman left home around 10:30 a.m. The last time security cameras captured Lauren was at 10:52 a.m. The footage shows her walking carefree along the park path. The beautiful young woman was dressed in a pink sports top, black leggings, and sneakers. She only had her phone and keys with her. No one ever saw her alive again. Lauren was supposed to show up for work at 11:30 a.m., but she neither arrived nor notified anyone about being late or absent. This was uncharacteristic for the extremely responsible young woman. Colleagues tried to call her several times, but to no avail. Lauren's phone was turned off. Worried friends inundated each other with messages on instant messengers, hoping to find out if anyone knew about the young woman's whereabouts. But no one knew anything, as she had not been seen after leaving home that morning. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Lauren's anxious parents, who also could not reach her, drove to their daughter's apartment. They hoped that the young woman was just feeling unwell and therefore did not go to work. However, she was not at home either, although all her things remained in place. The doors were locked, with no signs of a struggle or robbery. It seemed as if Lauren had gone for a walk and simply not returned. Without wasting a minute, the family filed a missing person report with the police. Law enforcement officers immediately began a search, but it did not yield quick results. That day, April 28, it was sunny and warm in Phoenix, as always. Unfortunately, there were hardly any people in the park where Lauren was walking. If someone had been passing by during the attack, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. But this did not happen. Lauren was last seen alone on her way to the park, after which the young woman disappeared and did not answer calls. All day, law enforcement officers and concerned citizens actively combed the surrounding area and park in search of any traces of the missing woman. They looked under every bush, checked every corner, and questioned everyone they met. But all efforts were in vain. Lauren's family nurtured the hope that perhaps the young woman had simply gotten lost, been delayed by some business, or spontaneously gone to visit friends in another area of the city. They incessantly called her, sent messages. But there was still no news of Lauren's whereabouts. With each passing hour, hope faded and fear for the young woman's life grew. Her parents, brother, and friends were beside themselves with anxiety and despair. It all resembled a nightmare. But the next morning, April 29, around 11 a.m., the worst happened. Lauren's body was accidentally discovered by a passerby, a woman walking her dog nearby. She immediately recognized the young woman, as she often walked this route. Just by the trail, in the bushes, the dog sensed something horrifying. Upon approaching closer, the woman saw Lauren's bloody body. Without wasting a second, she called the police. Law enforcement officers promptly arrived at the scene. A terrible sight unfolded before their eyes. Lauren's lifeless body lay just 3 meters from the trail in the thicket. It was covered in numerous stab wounds. The young woman lay on her back, her arms limply spread, her clothes torn and blood-stained. Everything around was drenched in blood. Forensic experts immediately set to work. According to preliminary conclusions, death occurred on April 28 around 11 a.m. from blood loss caused by deep stab wounds. The body had 15 wounds, most likely inflicted with a folding knife.
The wound in the back area was fatal. The nature of the injuries indicated that the attack and murder lasted for some time. The wounds were located in different parts of the body, with varying depths and shapes. The injuries on the young woman's hands indicated her desperate resistance. Deep cuts on both sides of her palms evidently appeared when Lauren tried to grab the knife blade, deflecting it from herself. The police realized that the young woman had fought for her life until the very end. But the attacker turned out to be remarkably strong and aggressive. The attack took the victim completely by surprise. Scratches on her back, shoulders, and torn clothing allowed them to assume that the criminal had crept up from behind, knocked Lauren off her feet, and begun inflicting stab wounds. Then he turned the young woman onto her back and continued his bloody rampage. At the crime scene, a clear footprint of a sneaker, size 42-43, was found, presumably the attacker's footwear. A thorough examination of the surrounding area showed that during the violent altercation, Lauren had desperately tried to save herself. She crawled, tried to hide in the bushes, but to no avail. Bloody trails stretched for several meters from the young woman's body, testifying to her final and so unequal struggle. The poor girl called for help with her last ounce of strength, but unfortunately, at that early hour in the deserted park, no one was nearby. A few meters from the site of the tragedy, another testament to Lauren's desperate desire to survive, was found a fence with barbed wire, which she had apparently frantically tried to climb over. On the sharpened edges of the wire, pieces of torn fabric and traces of blood remained. Experts suggested that the numerous abrasions and scratches on the young woman's body appeared precisely during the attempt to overcome this obstacle. Nearby, Lauren's personal belongings were found: her phone and apartment keys. Evidently, they had fallen out of her clothing pockets during the fight with the attacker, but neither a wallet nor other valuables were found on the deceased. This immediately allowed them to rule out the version of a murder committed for the purpose of robbery. The young woman's mobile phone was broken. The last incoming and outgoing calls were dated the evening of April 27. That is, for almost a day and a half, there had been no news from Lauren. Further thorough examination of the area allowed forensic experts to come across another important find. Among the branches not far from the body lay a bloody folding knife, the probable murder weapon. The blade and handle of the knife were covered in fingerprints and other DNA traces belonging to an unknown man. Fragments of hair and epithelial cells that could have come from the killer were also seized at the crime scene.
The body of the deceased and all the discovered physical evidence were urgently sent for examination. In parallel, investigators began carefully studying the footage from surveillance cameras. Fortunately, one of them captured Lauren entering the park at 10:52 a.m. The young woman was alone, wearing headphones, listening to music. Nothing suspicious was noticed, but literally a minute later, the silhouette of a tall, slender man in dark clothing flashed across the recording. He ran very quickly past the camera as if trying to hide his face. Despite this, experts managed to discern that it was a young African-American man wearing a baseball cap. His height, build, skin color, and clothing elements all matched the description of the person whose traces were found at the crime scene. Another camera located near the park exit captured the same man literally flying out from around the corner, looking around at 10:59 am. Then he tries with all his might to climb over the fence, but his clothes get caught on the spikes. In the end, the perpetrator simply jumps over the fence, loses his cap in the process, and disappears in an unknown direction as fast as his legs can carry him. These video recordings became the first glimmer of hope for the investigators, and although the identity of the criminal had not yet been established, law enforcement now had a clear description and identifying characteristics of the person to be found. Interestingly, the time of the mysterious man's appearance in the park, according to preliminary expert conclusions, almost exactly coincided with the time of Lauren's murder. That is, the cameras captured the probable killer immediately before committing the crime and right after it. A thorough analysis of the video recordings, a frame-by-frame examination of each second, revealed several more important details. First, the suspect moved in an extremely purposeful and fast manner, constantly looking around as if afraid of being noticed. Second, he appeared in the park literally half a minute after Lauren, apparently following her. And after committing the crime, the perpetrator rushed to flee, away from the park entrance, climbing over the fence in order to disappear from the scene as quickly as possible. All this confirmed the theory that the murder was intentional, planned, and quite possibly far from the first on the perpetrator's track record. He acted quickly, brazenly, skillfully covering his tracks. And yet, in the heat of the escape, he made a few unfortunate mistakes that allowed the cameras to capture him, at least partially. The surveillance camera footage was immediately shown to Lauren's relatives and friends. Unfortunately, none of them could recognize anyone familiar in the man in the frames. Of course, everyone was stunned and deeply saddened by this tragedy. The family could not believe that someone could deliberately, with particular cruelty, take the life of their kind, bright girl. Lauren had no enemies or conflicts, no debts to her name. No valuables or large sums of cash were found on her. She did not lead a risky lifestyle. Therefore, the versions of murder for personal reasons or for mercenary purposes had to be discarded. A week after the tragic events, a press conference was held, at which representatives of law enforcement agencies spoke. They informed the public about all the evidence found and asked for help in identifying the suspect. Lauren's father, barely holding back tears, begged everyone who had any information to report it to the police. Relatives set a substantial monetary reward for information that would allow them to track down the killer. Lauren's story shook the entire city. Thousands of concerned citizens responded to the call. People spread information on social networks, organized search groups, and volunteered. In parallel, painstaking work with physical evidence continued. DNA traces, fingerprints, and other biological materials were thoroughly studied in a specialized laboratory. The persistence of the experts finally bore fruit. The genetic profile of the suspects matched the data contained in the police database. The system issued a name Zion William Teasley, a 22-year-old African-American who had several prior convictions. Detectives immediately set about studying the identity of the possible criminal. It turned out that Zion was raised in a dysfunctional family. His parents abused alcohol and drugs. The young man's problems with the law began in childhood thefts, hooligan antics, threats. In 2020, he was convicted of a series of armed robberies. After serving almost a year behind bars, Zion was released early for good behavior. He was last arrested in January 2023 for an assault with a knife on a random passerby. But then the victim withdrew the statement, so Teasley got off with a suspended sentence. At the time of Lauren's death, Zion was under the supervision of law enforcement and had to regularly check in at the police station. He last appeared for the mandatory check on April 27, the day before the tragedy in the park. Armed with this information, the detectives began to devise a plan to apprehend the suspect. Round-the-clock surveillance was established on Teasley.
It soon became known that at that time, he was not working anywhere and practically never left home, only rarely visiting a store or meeting with some dubious characters. Having obtained an arrest warrant, the operatives went to Zion's apartment. They had to break down the door, but there was no one inside. During a thorough search, the police came across a bucket with bleach, rubber gloves, and rags. It seemed that the suspect was trying to destroy all traces of his involvement in the crime. Fortunately, he did not have time to complete the task. In Teasley's room, they found a suitcase hastily stuffed with clothes. Right there lay a brand new passport in someone else's name and bus tickets to Canada. It appeared that the young man was planning to flee the country in the near future. Investigators suggested that Zion had learned about the search and decided to hide from justice. A large-scale special operation was launched. Orientations on Zion Teasley were sent to all states. The Border Service was warned about the need to detain the murder suspect. Patrols were on duty at train stations, airports, and major highways. Detectives carefully tracked calls from the fugitive's phone, determining his location by cellular tower signals. At the same time, investigators did not stop gathering evidence. They managed to find several witnesses who had seen Zion Teasley stalking Lauren on the eve of her death. One woman noticed him loitering near the young woman's entrance, as if waiting for her. Another man had seen the suspect in the same park a couple of days before the tragedy. A thorough study of Zion's past showed that this was far from the first case of his attacks on members of the weaker sex. A month before Lauren's murder, Teasley was detained for harassing some patron of a nightclub. And even earlier, a girl he was dating had filed a statement about being beaten by him. However, the case was closed at the time due to lack of evidence. By all indications, Zion was an extremely unbalanced, aggressive type. He openly despised women, considering them inferior beings. His posts were found on social networks where he called them the worst words. And also on the suspects' pages, they discovered photos with knives very similar to the murder weapon. Investigators made the assumption that Lauren had likely become a random victim of a maniac. Zion may have seen her on the street, followed her, and then attacked her in a secluded place. It's possible that something about the girl provoked his morbid aggression, her attractive appearance, carefree attitude, headphones in her ears. Experts say that types like Teasley sometimes perceive female vulnerability as a trigger for attack. Lauren's relatives were shocked by the brutality and senselessness of the crime. They couldn't believe that someone was capable of so inhumanly taking their daughter's life just because she went for a walk. The girl's father made an impassioned public appeal. He urged everyone to refrain from any attempts at vigilante justice and allow the police to act within the law to punish the perpetrator. Finally, 3 days after the manhunt was announced, Zion Teasley was apprehended. He was hiding in a dilapidated garage on the outskirts of the city. During the arrest, he resisted fiercely, managing to wound one of the police officers. During interrogation, the suspect behaved defiantly. At first, he claimed to have nothing to do with the crime and that it was the first time he had ever seen the deceased girl. Then he began denying his very presence in the park that day, and when shown the surveillance camera footage, he abruptly fell silent and demanded a lawyer. The prosecutor promptly charged Zion Teasley with formal charges of intentional murder and kidnapping. Among the weighty evidence were surveillance recordings, Lauren's personal belongings found in the suspect's garage, the murder weapon, DNA traces and fingerprints found at the crime scene. The court ruled on a pre-trial detention measure without the possibility of bail. The trial of Zion Teasley began on June 5, 2023. It was one of the most high-profile crimes in the state's history. The entire country closely followed the proceedings. Crowds of reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens thronged outside the courthouse. Everyone wanted to see in person the person who committed such a heinous murder. Zion was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs under heavy escort. He wore an orange prison jumpsuit, and an indifferent expression was frozen on his face. In contrast, Lauren's loved ones did not restrain their emotions. Her mother wept inconsolably. Her father cast angry glances at the defendant. Friends of the deceased were also present in the courtroom, holding her photographs. In his opening statement, the prosecutor made every effort to convince the jury that Zion Teasley was a cruel and cynical killer who posed a significant threat to society. He placed particular emphasis on the audacious nature of the crime and the numerous pieces of evidence that testified against the defendant. According to the prosecutor, Zion was a psychopath who harbored hatred toward women and derived pleasure from inflicting pain on them. Teasley's defense attorney, for his part, tried to prove his client's innocence. He called into question the evidence provided, suggesting that someone else could have been Lauren's killer. The defender urged the jury not to succumb to emotions and public pressure, but to be guided solely by the facts. He also mentioned Zion's difficult childhood and the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his closest relatives. At present, Zion William Teasley has been charged with first-degree intentional homicide. In December 2023, the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office filed a motion to seek the death penalty against the defendant, as prescribed by Arizona state law for particularly serious crimes. The Phoenix Police Department officially announced the completion of the investigation and the transfer of the case materials to court for prosecution of the suspect. There is currently no information to indicate that the attack on Lauren Hake was anything other than a random victim selection by the perpetrator. Zion Teasley himself continues to deny any involvement in this brutal murder. He remains in custody without bail. The trial is scheduled for October 2025. It is expected to be one of the most high-profile trials in Arizona history. The tragic death of Lauren Hake has stunned all of America, truly shocking her family and friends. A young woman who so loved life and believed in goodness was killed by a brutal murderer for absolutely no reason. This crime has once again reminded society of the importance of public safety and timely response to troubling signs of disturbed behavior in individuals. Lauren's story has also demonstrated how crucial coordinated work by law enforcement is. It was thanks to the prompt and professional actions of the police that they were able to quickly get on the trail of the suspect, apprehend him, and collect substantial evidence of guilt. Ahead lies the high-profile trial of this case, which is set to put a final period and determine the punishment for the killer. Society hopes for a fair sentence and the most severe punishment for the perpetrator. But most importantly, the bright memory of Lauren Hake must live on in the hearts of all who knew and loved this wonderful girl. She will forever remain young, beautiful, kind, and sincere. On October 25, 1976, the Forosov family, headed by Ural Forosov, a renowned professor of constitutional law at the University of Claremont in sunny California, experienced a defining moment: the birth of their first child, a baby girl named Kristen. As my colleagues recounted, the Forosovs were over the moon with happiness, as the arrival of the little one was a wonderful addition to their successful life. Thanks to their high positions and status in society, they could provide their children with everything necessary for a comfortable existence and development. Soon, the family welcomed two more boys, Brent and Pierce, who became Kristen's younger brothers. However, the parents paid special attention to the upbringing and education of their eldest daughter. From an early age, Constance, the girl's mother, took it upon herself to unlock Kristen's potential. She enrolled her in ballet and modeling classes, hoping that these fields would open up a brilliant future for the child. And it must be said, not for nothing, as Kristen showed remarkable talent in both areas. Often, parents project their own ambitions and unrealized dreams onto their children. Sometimes this can lead to negative consequences, as the child doesn't always share the adult's vision of their life path. But for now, Kristen enthusiastically immersed herself in the world of dance and the catwalk. It seemed that a dizzying career full of bright prospects awaited her. Nothing foreshadowed trouble until one day a tragedy occurred that forever changed the girl's fate. In my opinion, the parents should have listened more to Kristen's own desires instead of imposing their vision of the future on her. However, who knew that an innocent childhood hobby would turn into such a dramatic twist in the life of this family? Just yesterday, Kristen was a rising ballet star, and today her future in this field is under threat. My colleagues managed to find out that dancing became not just a hobby or a whim of her parents for the girl, but a true calling. She lived and breathed ballet, despite her young age. Kristen was, without a doubt, an incredibly talented child. Her plasticity, grace, and artistry captivated the audience during each performance. The girl easily outshone professional dancers, demonstrating remarkable potential. Critics had already begun to compare her with leading ballerinas of our time, and producers predicted a brilliant career on the most prestigious stages of the world. These predictions seemed quite realistic, as Kristen was developing at an incredible pace. If everything had continued like this, she would have undoubtedly become a prima ballerina in one of the leading theaters in Europe or Russia. But life sometimes throws unexpected surprises, and they are not always pleasant. One such unpleasant surprise was a serious injury that Kristen received during training. A torn ligament in the ankle, it would seem a trifle because a child's body usually regenerates quickly. But the doctors were relentless. The damage was so significant that it would be impossible to return to the previous form. For the girl, this meant the collapse of all her dreams and hopes. As a detective, I perfectly understand that such situations can break anyone, not to mention a young, fragile girl. Losing the meaning of life at such an age is a real tragedy. But Kristen had to come to terms with the idea that her stellar ballet career had ended before it even began. But what happened next shocked me. Kristen, who only yesterday was full of hopes and dreams, now found herself at the bottom of despair. Her heart was broken, and her soul was drowning in an abyss of sorrow. Instead of enjoying her youth and planning for the future, the girl plunged into depression. And this is not surprising because she lost not just her favorite thing, but the meaning of life. But instead of fighting her demons, Kristen chose the easiest path and escape from reality. Before she even had time to finish school properly, she fell into the grip of alcohol and drugs. For her parents, this came as a real shock. They had no idea that their talented daughter could stoop to such a thing. Suddenly, it turned out that Kristen was not only using prohibited substances, but also spending the money her parents gave her for pocket expenses on them. The family began to have constant quarrels and conflicts. The tension grew every day until the situation got out of control. It got to the point where the police had to be called to calm the passions. It's hard to even imagine what the Forsyths had to go through in those days.
Just yesterday, they were proud of their daughter and made plans for her brilliant future. And today they found themselves at the epicenter of a family drama. However, despite the pain and disappointment, they did not turn away from Kristen. The parents continued to support her, hoping that these were only temporary difficulties. And indeed, after a few months, the situation began to stabilize gradually. Kristen was still suffering from depression and cravings for psychoactive substances, but at least she was no longer throwing tantrums or running away from home. It seemed that the worst was over, and now the family could overcome this crisis together. In my opinion, this case clearly demonstrates how fragile the human psyche can be. It is worth only one detail to fail, and the whole structure begins to fall apart before our eyes. And if it weren't for the support of loved ones, who knows how it would have ended for Kristen. But new trials awaited her ahead, which were to finally temper her character. But not everything is so good, because what was next struck me. 1994 became a year of new beginnings and hopes for Kristen. She finally pulled herself together and decided to start life from scratch. The girl realized that she could not endlessly feel sorry for herself and cry over a lost dream. If a ballet career no longer shines for her, then she can always try to realize herself in another field. Kristen decides to enter university to obtain higher education in a new profession. For her, this was a bold step, because not so long ago, she did not see the point in life at all. But despite all her efforts, the ghosts of the past continue to haunt the girl. Her mental health, although improved compared to previous years, still remained fragile. In 1995, a relapse occurred that almost cost Kristen her life. Depression returned with renewed vigor, clouding the mind and paralyzing the will. The girl again found herself on the edge of the abyss, from where, it seemed, there was no return. She was ready to take a fatal step in order to get rid of the suffering that was poisoning her existence once and for all. But fate decreed otherwise. The suicide attempt was unsuccessful, and Kristen was saved at the last moment. This incident became a kind of point of no return, after which the girl realized that she could no longer exist like this. She had to change something in her life in order not to go crazy completely. That's when Kristen makes a desperate decision to temporarily leave her family and go on a trip to another country. She gets on a plane and flies to the city of Texona, on the border of Mexico and the USA. Perhaps a change of scenery and new impressions will help her reboot her consciousness and find new meanings. In my opinion, this step was quite risky, given Kristen's unstable mental state. After all, it is unknown how she will behave in a foreign country, far from family and friends. But sometimes it is such radical decisions that help people get out of the deepest depressive states. I had to hold my breath from what happened next. Sometimes life throws us unexpected surprises in the most unexpected places. So Kristen, who went to Mexico in search of peace of mind, met her destiny there. Greg DeVillas, a 22-year-old guy traveling with his brothers, accidentally ended up in the same city as her. Their paths crossed, and a spark immediately flashed between the young people. Over the next few days, Kristen and Greg spent time together, enjoying each other's company. It seemed that they had known each other for an eternity, so harmoniously and effortlessly they communicated. It was true love at first sight, which grew and strengthened with every minute. Even when it was time to return home, the lovers did not want to part and agreed to meet again. Barely setting foot on American soil, Kristen and Greg began to actively build their relationship. They constantly met, spent every free minute together, and soon realized that they could not live without each other. That's when Kristen agreed to move in with Greg. At that time, the young man was renting an apartment with his brother and a friend. But love is able to overcome any inconvenience, so Kristen agreed to such cohabitation without hesitation. But before deciding on this step, she decided to be as frank as possible with her chosen one. The girl told him about her mental health problems, about prolonged depression, and about the struggle with addiction, which was still ongoing. Greg was not at all frightened by this confession.
He knew perfectly well that the abuse of psychoactive substances could destroy not only Kristen's health, but also their relationship. But the guy was firmly determined to support his beloved in this difficult struggle. His feelings were so strong and sincere that he was ready to make any sacrifices for the sake of their common future. From the point of view of a detective, I can only approve of Greg's position. Unfortunately, in my practice, I have often encountered cases where lovers turned away from each other at the first difficulties. And here is a young guy who has barely graduated from university, showing remarkable maturity and wisdom. As often happens, the black streak in Kristen's life was not limited to just one problem. The girl had barely begun to settle in a new place when things began to disappear in Greg's apartment. Today it's some kind of jewelry, tomorrow it's cash, and then checks. Of course, everyone immediately began to suspect the new inhabitant, because before her appearance, such incidents did not happen. But Kristen categorically denied her involvement in these thefts. She assured that she didn't even think about anything like that. The girl sincerely believed that she had managed to convince her roommates of her innocence when suddenly the incredible happened: the missing items were found in her purse. This incident came as a real shock to all the residents of the apartment. One of Greg's brothers even decided to move out, as he could no longer trust Kristen. He was convinced that the girl had deceived them by pretending to be an innocent sheep, but in fact, she simply took advantage of their gullibility. But Greg was in no hurry to condemn his beloved. He knew perfectly well that addiction can push a person to the worst deeds. Theft, deception, manipulation, all these are just side effects of the disease that Kristen was trying to fight. And although the fact of her guilt was obvious, Greg was not going to turn away from the girl. In my opinion, this situation clearly demonstrates the true essence of love. After all, it would have been so easy for Greg to wave his hand at a troubled girl and find himself another life partner. However, he decided not to give up and continue to take care of Kristen, helping her fight addiction. This required a lot of patience, wisdom, and strength of mind because a long and thorny path awaited them. Everything would be fine, but after the following events, I had to sit down. They say that true love can work miracles, and the story of Kristen and Greg is a vivid confirmation of this. Despite all the hardships and trials, the young man never once turned away from his chosen one. Day after day, week after week, he patiently helped her overcome the consequences of addiction, believing that the day would come when she would finally be able to return to a full life. And that day has come. Thanks to Greg's unconditional support and care, Kristen managed to achieve what seemed impossible just a few months ago: complete detoxification of the body. It was an incredible victory because the girl had to go through real hell, fighting her own demons. But her path to recovery did not end there. Kristen understood that she had to radically change her life in order to never return to the past again. She decides to enter the University of San Diego, where she begins to study diligently. The girl quickly becomes one of the best students in the course, demonstrating remarkable abilities and diligence. As a result, in 1998, Kristen received a diploma with honors. This achievement opens up new horizons for her, and the girl gets a job as a toxicologist at the Bureau of Forensic Medicine. Finally, she found her calling and can start life from scratch. It would seem that here it is long-awaited happiness. A stable job, a bright future ahead, and most importantly, a beloved man nearby. Greg, who went through all the trials with Kristen, decides to propose to her. He gets down on one knee and asks for her hand, dreaming of forever uniting his life with this amazing woman. From the point of view of a person who has seen a lot of broken destinies, I can only applaud Kristen and Greg. They prove that true feelings can overcome any difficulties. But will this be enough for a long and happy life? Rumor has it that on the eve of the wedding, the bride began to doubt her decision. Anxiety did not leave me, and not only me. Kristen, without hesitation, agrees to marry Greg, the man who was there for her during the most difficult moments of her life. It would seem that here it is the long-awaited happiness that one can only dream of. But fate decided to play a cruel joke on the young couple. A few weeks before the wedding, Kristen begins to be enveloped in doubts. The girl is seized by anxiety. She begins to panic, thinking about future married life. What if this decision turns out to be a mistake? Is she ready to take on such a responsibility? These and many other questions do not give Kristen peace day or night. In the end, she decides to turn to her parents for advice. Fortunately, loved ones find the right words to support their daughter. They assure her that doubts before the wedding are an absolutely normal phenomenon. Every bride experiences something similar because marriage is a serious step that changes your whole life. The main thing is to listen to your heart and not be afraid of the future. These wise instructions help Kristen calm down and believe in herself. And so, on June 5, 1999, the newlyweds finally step on the wedding towel. The ceremony is wonderful, the bride and groom are shining with happiness, and the guests sincerely rejoice for them. It seems that all fears and doubts are left behind, and only a bright and carefree life awaits the couple ahead. But as often happens, the euphoria from the wedding quickly passes, and grey weekdays come to replace it. A few months after the wedding, Kristen again begins to feel some strange anxiety. She confesses to her friends that she feels unhappy and depressed in her relationship with her husband. And then a new employee appears at work, Dr. Michael Robertson. This attractive Australian immediately attracts Kristen's attention. She begins to spend more and more time with him, discussing work issues. At least, this is how it looks from the outside. But my colleagues say that in fact, some special chemistry arose between these two. And very soon, the working relationship grew into something more. Well, from the point of view of an experienced detective, I can say that such situations happen more often than we would like. Sometimes people just can't resist temptation, especially when not everything is going well in their personal life. But in this case, the consequences of this reckless step will be simply fatal. The flirting between Kristen and Michael became so frank and undisguised that even the most naive and trusting colleagues began to suspect something. They constantly whispered, exchanged meaningful glances, and at the first opportunity remained alone. Some even saw this couple secluded in Michael's office during their lunch break, and although there was no direct evidence of a secret romance, all these little things added up to a rather eloquent picture. And indeed, the relationship between Kristen and Michael went far beyond business. They became so carried away with each other that they completely forgot about their marital duties. It seemed that they did not care about the feelings of their partners who were waiting for them at home. Love turned out to be stronger than common sense and a sense of duty. But the worst was yet to come. Having plunged headlong into this passionate romance, Kristen broke down again. All of Greg's efforts were in vain. His wife returned to her worst demon, drugs. And this time the temptation was greater than ever, because now she had direct access to prohibited substances right at her workplace. The forensic department stored various narcotic drugs seized from crime scenes. One of Kristen's direct duties was the accounting and control of these substances. That is, in fact, she could freely take whatever she wanted without fear of being exposed, and the girl took full advantage of this opportunity. From the point of view of professional ethics, such abuse of official position is unacceptable and even criminal. Any law enforcement officer is obliged to immediately report such an incident to their superiors. But Michael decided otherwise. Having learned about his beloved's problems, he not only did not condemn her, but also undertook to cover up Kristen's antics. In my opinion, this was a fatal step, and this untied her hands completely. Now her decline was only a matter of time, and nothing could stop this process. While Kristen and Michael enjoyed their secret romance, Greg, as always, remained in the dark. The poor guy sincerely believed in his wife's fidelity, not even suspecting that something was going on behind his back. He continued to swear eternal love to her, not noticing the obvious signs of betrayal. But in the end, the truth came out. One day, Greg accidentally came across a love letter written by Michael to Kristen. This scrap of paper, hidden in a woman's purse, became a real bomb that shattered their marriage to smithereens. The man was shocked and enraged at the same time. How could she do this after everything he had done for her?
But what struck Greg the most was not even the marital infidelity. Much worse was the fact that because of her relationship with Michael, Kristen started using drugs again. All the efforts that Greg had made to pull her out of this swamp turned out to be in vain. His wife simply spat in his soul, destroying the last hope for a happy family life. Of course, Greg was not going to remain silent. In a fit of anger and indignation, he threatened to expose everything to Kristen's superiors. And this was not an empty threat. The man perfectly understood that for such antics, his wife and her lover could not only be fired from work, but also brought to criminal responsibility. However, that day the quarrel ended in nothing. The couple was simply tired of figuring out their relationship and decided to postpone this conversation until the morning. The next working day, Greg did not show up for work. His absence caused concern among the management, because the man had always been distinguished by punctuality and responsibility. An attempt to call him did not yield any results. The phone was hopelessly silent. At the same time, Kristen, as if nothing had happened, went to work. She even found time to chat with Michael, although she tried not to draw too much attention to it.
Meanwhile, a real horror was waiting for her at home. Returning home for a lunch break, Kristen found her husband unconscious in bed. Greg was barely breathing, his body covered in cold sweat. The woman panicked and rushed to call an ambulance. The dispatcher on the other end of the line instructed her on how to properly perform artificial respiration and heart massage, but all attempts to bring her husband back to consciousness were in vain. When the medics arrived at the scene, a chilling picture opened up to their eyes: Greg's lifeless body lying on the bed, strewn with red rose petals. And next to it lay Kristen's open diary, open to the page where she mused about how she would leave her husband for a new life. These details immediately led the medics to certain reflections. At the hospital, Greg was officially declared dead. A shocked Kristen, through tears, told the police about her terrible day, not forgetting to mention the rose petals. They say it was a symbol of her and Greg's breakup. To be honest, it sounded too melodramatic, and Kristen's own behavior raised many questions. Did she really hope that her husband would simply let her go to another? However, the autopsy showed that Greg's death was due to an overdose of psychotropic substances, and this raised even more questions because the man had always been an opponent of drugs. Is all this just a tragic suicide or someone's insidious plan? But here is the brother of the deceased, Jerome, absolutely convinced that Kristen is behind all this, and it seems that he is determined to achieve justice at all costs and expose the deceitful daughter-in-law. At least, the man immediately began to act. He regularly called Kristen, recording all the conversations, and at the same time pressured the police, demanding a thorough investigation of the case. Jerome's persistence, the brother of the deceased Greg, was not in vain. Under his pressure, the investigators still returned to the investigation of the case, even though the initial version of suicide seemed quite plausible. And then one of the detectives notices an interesting detail: Greg's remains were sent for autopsy to the same department of forensic medicine where Kristen worked. It would seem that there is nothing strange because it is a standard procedure. But the person responsible for the autopsy turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson, the lover of the suspect. And this forced the investigation to look at this whole story from a different angle. Digging deeper, the detectives found out that just a few hours before her husband's death, Kristen had managed not only to give consent for the donation of his organs, but also to prepare everything necessary for the cremation of the body. Such efficiency in the actions of the grieving widow was difficult to write off as a coincidence, and the examination conducted by Robertson raised many questions. To avoid any doubts and manipulations, it was decided to conduct repeated toxicological tests in an independent laboratory in Los Angeles, and the results were shocking. They differed significantly from those obtained in San Diego. Yes, traces of psychoactive substances were indeed found in Greg's body, but one of the drugs exceeded the lethal dose by as much as 7 times. That is, this substance was fatally dangerous for a person in such an amount. Of course, a natural question immediately arises: why was a private laboratory able to detect this drug, and the forensic experts of San Diego did not? Did they simply not notice the obvious? Although, on the other hand, there is an explanation, because we are talking about a very rare and dangerous drug, tests for which are usually not prescribed in routine cases. But this does not remove other issues. As Kristen claims, her husband was alive and relatively healthy during the day, although he looked somewhat sluggish. So why did he drop dead in the evening from such a crazy dose of the drug? And why was fluid found in his lungs, indicating repeated loss of consciousness? How could a person in such a state lay out rose petals on the bed and then calmly go to sleep? Is a drug addict with such experience would keep at home any vial of his medicines? Even more questions arose after the interrogation of the ambulance crew. It turns out that the medics arrived at the call just 3 minutes after Kristen's call, and when they entered the bedroom, the woman for some reason was not near her husband's body, but in a completely different room. Paramedics also noted that Kristen was unlikely to have performed heart massage, at least for the last few minutes before their arrival, because there was no characteristic redness from chest compression on Greg's chest. The investigators also carefully studied the recording of the conversation between Kristen and the ambulance dispatcher on that fatal night, and they came to the conclusion that the tape does not contain sounds that usually accompany resuscitation procedures. Did the widow not try at all to save her dying husband, or did she simply lack the skill to simulate the provision of assistance? However, this is not the only thing that the detectives found out. Thanks to the testimony of one of the police officers who was at the scene and then accompanied the body to the hospital, it became known that on that night Kristen met with some man. They even hugged in front of the cop, and this mysterious guest turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson.
so a search in the offices of both lovers was only a matter of time. And although Michael admitted that he covered up petty thefts of drugs by Kristen, which she used, he allegedly had nothing to do with the disappearance of other substances from the warehouse. However, trusting the words of a person who has just been fired for an official crime would be at least naive. One thing can be said for sure: the investigation of this case is far from over. Ahead, the investigators have a lot of work to do, because the evidence pointing to Kristen's involvement in her husband's death continues to accumulate, and an avalanche of compromising evidence is about to bury her head. The least of which are love messages found on the suspect's work computers, and most importantly, correspondence in which lovers directly discuss the same drug that became fatal for Greg. And as if that were not enough, there is information that Kristen and Michael at one time attended a special presentation dedicated to the properties and dangers of this substance. Did they just take an interest in the topic for work purposes? Or maybe they were thinking about something more sinister. No less strange are Kristen's actions on the day of Greg's death. When buying roses, she paid in cash for some reason, as if she wanted to hide this purchase. But the system still recorded the goods she selected, because the woman naively used her loyalty card. And what do we see? A red rose turned out to be a mandatory attribute of the posthumous installation. Coincidence? I do not think so. Meanwhile, Michael Robertson quietly left the S, going to look after his sick mother in Australia. A convenient legend, isn't it? Especially considering that in his homeland, American laws will not reach him. However, even from there, he will not be able to escape justice. After all, 7 months later, on June 25, 2001, Kristen Frost was officially charged with the murder of her husband. Despite all her assurances of innocence and appeals to the version of suicide, the jury found the woman guilty. And in my opinion, absolutely rightly, there was too much incontrovertible evidence collected against her. So the judge passed the only correct sentence: life imprisonment without the right to early release. Does this mean that the case is closed? Not at all. After all, there is one more person involved, Michael Robertson, who continues to hide abroad. However, sooner or later they will get him too. I would even say that it's only a matter of time, because an arrest warrant for the doctor has already been issued. American cops will just have to show a little more ingenuity and persistence to drag this scum to justice.